So with the Cerastus Knight Lancer getting a big new shiny model playable in Warhammer 40k, let's take a look at how strong this tall knight is, both for the Imperium and for Chaos. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking knights once more, and in this video I thought we'd do a review of the Cerastus Knight Lancer, talk briefly about the new model, and then an overview for both Imperium and Chaos, any obvious buffs and synergies, and how strong I think it is in-game. In the lore and background, the Knight Lancer is a Cerastus class knight, a taller and faster pattern than the Questoris cousins, though somewhat of a rarity in contemporary Warhammer 40k, seen as a bit of an ancient relic knight armour class. The Lancer itself kind of embodies the jousting knight of old, its primary weapon being the Cerastus shock lance to charge in and just destroy enemy war machines and other great big vehicles, and it pairs that with an iron gauntlet shield. Far greater and more flexible protection than the regular ion shields of the standard Questoris and Cerastus Knight classes, particularly in melee combat when it's jousting against its peers. In battle, these guys are used as rapid strike machines, fine-tuned for close quarters assaults, tend to be a fairly prized asset within the household, and they have temperamental and restive machine spirits that just can't wait to get to the front and get stuck into combat. As mentioned, the Knight Lancer has a new upcoming plastic kit, playable both in Warhammer 40k and Heresy, and to know for a fact there's a whole load of Imperial and Chaos Knight collectors looking to add one to their collection in Warhammer 40k. I'm certainly going to be getting one of these myself for my own household at some point in the future. Previously there were Forge World kits that looked really quite similar in appearance. They were previously £225 or $345, so over twice the price of Games Workshop's regular knights. So fortunately the new kit price has gone down a fair bit. It's still £120, $200 or €155, putting it a little bit more expensive than the Knight Dominus kit that builds the Castellan or the Valiant. That one's $110 or $185. They have confirmed, unfortunately, that this one will only build the Knight Lancer. It doesn't build the Castigator or Acheron as the dual build kits. I guess they'll be following up later, sometime later in the year. I feel that was kind of a little bit of a disappointment. Would have been nice to have all three of the options built in one box so you could magnetise them out. The sprues did look pretty big and chunky looking though, so it's perhaps not all that surprising that it's just one box each. I'd guess they're probably charging a little bit more for it, as it is a bit bigger than some of the other knights. They do stand a fair bit taller, fairly significantly over the Questoris and Dominus. When they do go up for pre-order this weekend, then just bear in mind you can get them cheaper through third-party discount retailers. Element Games, if they follow their usual pricing structure, should have them for £102, so their usual 15% off. And Gap Games in Australia should have them for around about 20% off, probably a little bit less than $240 Australian dollars. Both of those are linked in the video description if you wanted to pre-order through either of those. Any purchases made through them do help support Auspex Tactics and keep all the videos coming. Getting into their rules though, and in Warhammer 40k, you can field them for Imperial Knights at 495 points, or Chaos Knights at 465, really quite a big points difference there. I think the main reason for the difference is in their special rule with the advance and charge thing that the Imperial Knights can pull off, and overall at that kind of points level, I'd say they're playable and interesting for both factions. I have a feeling that a fair few of them will be hitting the table once the plastic kit goes on full sale. As Imperial and Chaos Knights, you can also field them either as a Dreadblade or a Freeblade in another Chaos or Imperial army. Means that if you really wanted to, you could include one in basically any Imperial or Chaos force if you really wanted to. I'd argue it's probably not going to be the top competitive choice, but it certainly adds a big scary threat and a whole load of raw muscle. Though obviously has to be weighed up against any of the other knights, or just a whole chunk more points from your actual main index. I feel like for running them as Dreadblades and Freeblades for the Imperials, they lose quite a lot more running them like this. It means that you can't use the Bondsman ability, as you won't have any armigers to bond with, and that's really quite a big deal, giving it advance and charge. For Chaos, I feel like maybe it's a little bit more tempting that way round, as I think that its buffing ability just isn't really that pivotal, and it is a fair bit cheaper for basically the same raw stats. Getting into its actual datasheet though, let's talk through the basic rules of the Lancer, and then talk about the differences between Imperial Knights and Chaos. As a Cerastus pattern knight, it has a fairly similar stat line to the Questoris, Toughness 12, a 3+ save, Leadership 6 and Objective Control 10, but in general they tend to be faster and have a few more wounds, and the Lancer itself also gets a great big invulnerable save from that Ion Shield. For durability, it has 25 wounds and a 4+ invulnerable, really quite a nice increase over the standard Questoris. The extra wounds are pretty helpful, and the 4+ invulnerable save is very meaningful in melee, where Questoris often tend to be perhaps surprisingly fragile. Definitely makes it a lot more of an intimidating prospect to charge. You can always spike those invulnerable saves very high if you get lucky, and of course hit back the enemy very hard in close combat. It is quite nice against ranged attacks as well that there won't be any advantage in using command points to rotate ion shields or use Dread Bulwark, so it gets a 4+ invulnerable save either way, and you don't need to invest anything more to make it that. For its movement stat, it gets a 14-inch move, so that's +2 over the Gallant or Rampager for the Imperials or Chaos. Very nice for a dedicated melee knight to get it into combat where it wants to be. Just on its base movement, it's got around about a 21-inch charge threat range, which is pretty massive really, and the Imperials in particular can make that a bit longer with their Bondsman rule. Otherwise, probably worth noting that the explosion is pretty enormous if it does blow up, deadly demise d6+2. I'm still kind of sad that there's no command points to auto-explode the knights anymore. That'd be absolutely devastating on this kind of guy who wants to charge straight into the heart of the enemy army and then might well die. But if it does go up, then everything nearby is getting some massive damage. And finally for keywords, it is a character, so you can give it enhancements. And it does have the towering keyword as well, which is pretty much a flat disadvantage to the Knight Lancer. Means that it can't hide behind terrain, and it doesn't really have any enormous shooting of its own right. It was perhaps a little bit sad that it went up in points due to the towering keyword nerf, when it doesn't really benefit all that much. On the offensive, before it gets into combat, it gets to do a bit of range shooting with that Cerastus shock lance. Not really all that threatening, but 6 shots at strength 6, AP 0 and damage 2 at 12 inches. Plus it also has assault and sustained hits too. I think having assault is kind of nice for that. It means that there's no real compromise between advancing up the board and getting closer to combat, and you can still fire off a little bit of anti-infantry damage there. Sustained hits too means that on average with a roll of this you'll average 6 hits at that profile, though AP 0 means it's going to be unlikely to do anything all that consistent to anything with good armor saves. Could be good for killing a few light infantry though. Obviously its main threat is in combat, and its damage output here really is quite apocalyptic. It's got a very punchy melee profile, plus a pretty awesome special rule to get tank shock for 0 CP. So if you are charging in, you basically get that automatically. You'll usually be rolling 22 dice to try and get those 5+ for mortal wounds, so it means at least the majority of the time you'd expect 6 mortal wounds out of it, though you do have the opportunity to roll low. That is pretty massive combat threat just right from the start, and then it combines that with basically the profile of a Paragon Gauntlet. It gets 5 attacks with that shock lance, hitting at strength 20, AP 3 or damage 8 against the big stuff, hits on a 2+, and it also gets the lance keyword as well, so you should be wounding just about everything on a 2+ under normal circumstances. It also has a sweep profile as well, for 10 attacks at strength 10, AP 2 and damage 3. It means it's maybe not quite so super outstanding against hordes, but combining that with the tank shock should still mean that you rack up a whole bunch of body count. Between the two, I think you've got a very good chance of killing the majority of things that you charge with it. On average, you get around 13 dead Termagants, around about 7 or 8 dead Space Marines, 5 or 6 dead Terminators, so pretty outstanding against them with that sweep profile. Around 29 wounds to a toughness 10 vehicle with a 3+ save, so it's going to kill the vast majority of those unless you roll incredibly badly. And then in particular it excels at killing things like other knights in close combat. You average 24 wounds to a toughness 13 Dominus Knight with a 2+ save, though obviously it is going to be a bit swingy depending on whether or not you actually convert those attacks, or you get unlucky and roll a bunch of 1s. I feel like most of the time it's not really going to be too much of a question as to whether it's going to deal some massive damage to the enemy unit it's fighting. It's perhaps going to be more a challenge of getting it into the important stuff and not having it screened out of them. For the most part the rules are pretty similar depending on the Imperial Knight or the Chaos Knight version. The only major difference is in the special rule. The Imperial Knights get a Bondsman ability, whereas the Chaos Knights get an aura buff. The Imperial Knight's Bondsman ability, though, I think is absolutely standout. It means that if you have an Armiger to buff nearby, then both the Lancer and the Armiger get to advance and charge, which works out very nicely with that enormous movement threat. It means that with average rolling, you should expect to get into a unit that's around about 24 inches away from you. Usually that's going to be kind of impractical for your opponent to outrange. You could be pretty much charging from one deployment zone all the way into another pretty feasibly there. Never mind just reaching anything that's on midfield objectives. Kinda nice that a bonded Armiger can do similar as well. I guess you want to throw that on a Warglaive, and then back up the charge with a second one from a very fast little Warglaive, maybe making its way towards midfield objectives and skirmishing with something else. That's a really nice special rule, and I think the main reason that the Imperial Knight datasheet costs an extra 30 points over the Chaos one. Speaking of which, I think I'd argue that the Dark Favour special rule probably isn't quite as good for the Chaos. It doesn't actually help out the Lancer itself, but it basically gives you an aura of war dogs within 6 inches getting the assault keyword on their ranged weapons. It's perhaps a bit of an odd one that such a melee dedicated knight has a ranged buff as its aura buff, but I guess it's handy enough to have. I feel like this one isn't quite as huge, but it could still be pretty handy for the first turn of movement for a Chaos Knight army. Perhaps have a couple of Stalker or Huntsman war dogs nearby the Lancer and moving up to advance towards the midfield and get into the enemy, and they'll still be able to crack off a few shots with their Demon Breath spears, which is kind of handy. It definitely feels a lot less meaningful than the Imperial one, I think, though, and after turn 1 it's probably not going to be all that relevant, as you'd hope that the Lancer would have already made contact by the enemy by turn 2, so the Assault Aura is going to be a little bit redundant. Otherwise, for the Imperials and the Chaos, there's plenty of other buffs and synergies that you can use with them. The Imperial Knights get their Chivalric Code. They get to reroll a single hit and wound roll of 1, which is pretty huge on the melee, given that if you're fighting with the strike mode, then that's probably all that you're going to be failing the rolls on anyway. Just a bit more reliability, just in case you needed more with its already apocalyptic damage output. It could genuinely be an interesting choice for the +1 to move, advance and charge as well. It's better on this guy than virtually anything else, but it does mean that you're taking a lot of damage output away from the rest of the army unless you're literally building all for melee. Otherwise, the 6+ or 5+ Feel No Pain both definitely help when you've got an already very tanky knight as well. This thing's likely to be throwing itself into the face of the enemy, so it's going to be taking the brunt of their counter attack. Otherwise, for stratagems, the 0 CP tank shock is awesome. I feel like the majority of the other Imperial Knight stratagems though just aren't really all that great for it, and they're probably better used elsewhere. The one that is meaningful though is that if the enemy decides to countercharge and kill this in melee, 1 CP for fights and death is absolutely enormous given its combat profile. It means that you can guarantee its damage output for one last burst of damage that on either profile should add up to far more value than 1 CP is typically worth. Otherwise, I guess probably the biggest value that you're going to get out of stratagems could also be re-rolling charges. If you fail one, surprisingly, then it's going to be the difference between enormous damage or none, so that's about as high value as you could possibly get out of them. And you could also use Epic Challenge as well if you really wanted to smash a hidden character in a unit before the rest of the squad. That's the one that gives your character the precision blows thing, so you could basically impale something like a Custodes Shield Captain or similar with a great big shock lance and not have to go through the entire rest of the squad first. For the enhancements, I'm not entirely sure that the Imperial Knight ones are really very necessary for the extra points. Admittedly, Mysterious Guardian could be very fun. That's the Deep Strike Knight, and you could use its 2 rapid ingress from turn 2. Have a knight just turn up in the enemy turn, and then basically guarantee the charge the next turn after that. The enemy would likely be able to shoot it with any long-range heavy weapons given that it's so tall, but you might be able to outrange other stuff. I think in reality though, it might well just not be worth it. It's got an enormous great big movement stat, plus the advance and charge thing if you do start it on the board. It's definitely not impossible that you could be getting turn 1 charges off if your opponent moves up a little bit, so I kind of feel like investing more command points plus points in deep striking it might just be overkill, and you might just be better off having it on the board and threatening charges right from the first turn. Otherwise, I guess you could use Mythic Hero to allow multiple Armoured Warglaves to advance and charge, but I feel like this is going to be diminishing returns really compared with other things that you could use this on. I just feel like most of the time you're probably not going to have 2 different Warglaves that are going to be in a good position to advance and charge against things. Might happen occasionally, but I feel like it's a little bit situational to be buying it in here, compared with something like a Crusader that could be giving multiple knights +1 to hit each turn. Moving on to Chaos Knightly synergies, they get their dread abilities with the -1 to battle shock, or making enemy units test if they've had any damage, though I feel like the Lancer probably cares a little bit less about the +1 to wound compared with most given its enormous strength in combat. It'll be wounding really quite a lot of stuff on a 2+ already, so the +1 to wound in later game turns perhaps matters a bit less. I guess theoretically the shock lance shooting might actually be kind of useful to do a little bit of chip damage to a nearby enemy unit and force another unit to have to test battle shock. Could be a reasonable use of that, given that it's probably not going to do enough meaningful damage to be wiping squads or anything. Otherwise, for the Chaos Knight stratagems, I feel like quite a few are fairly useful, given that it's likely to be just smashing into the enemy lines and hopefully depleting units and causing battle shock, then Terror Shades could be quite nice to suck some more health out of a battle shocked enemy unit. Really quite nice to put more wounds onto a unit that's already tough with its 4+ invulnerable. There's a 1 command point for either a 6+ or 5+ Feel No Pain in the fight phase, if you are worried about enemy damage hitting it back hard, and I feel like it's going to be one of the best targets out there for Knights of Shade. That's the one that allows you to just ghost through enemy models or terrain pieces, combined with really quite a big scary movement characteristic that could be pretty great for defeating screening and actually getting into the most important units that the opponent has. Really quite a cool one to be able to threaten with 14 inches worth of movement. Otherwise they can still do the generic stratagems as we mentioned, It's kind of sad that a long leash can't be used on this one with the advance and shoot war dogs. I feel like that could have actually genuinely been quite a good power play turn 1. 1 CP for 3 advance and shoot brigands would have been very nice to get some lines of sight, but the stratagem specifies a abhorrent knight as the target. Enhancements wise, again, I'd probably be tempted just to leave it without anything else extra. I guess you could maybe use the one that allows you to take an objective and move on from it. That could be conceivably what the Lancer wants to do. I guess if you wanted it just to be absolutely as tough as possible, you could use the panoply of Cursed Knights. It definitely will be another barrier to enemies doing damage, though perhaps not all that relevant against that many attacks. In combat, it's only going to be relevant against AP-1 weapons before you hit the invulnerable save of the Lancer anyway, though I guess it could be relevant against AP-2 if you manage to get some cover as you're moving up against ranged attacks. In game, I think that the Lancer will generally have to play pretty aggressively. You can't really afford for 465 points or 495 points that can only work in melee not to be getting stuck in absolutely as soon as possible. I think that normally means just setting it up on the line on the deployment zone, threatening charges on midfield objectives, or potentially all the way into the opponent's deployment zone if you have the Imperial Knights advance and charge. I think as it goes, it's maybe not the worst big knights to be tanking damage, given the extra wounds and the 4+ invulnerable save compared with most of them. I think usually the game plan is going to be to throw it towards the enemy army, destroy whatever it can reach, and then have the enemy army attack it massively, hopefully drawing a bunch of fire from the rest of the knight force to do their thing. Probably the biggest choices are what it tries to charge and what it can manage to reach and go for. It might be a bit of a reactive knight in that way, as it depends on what your opponent actually leaves in range and how well they screen things. The super heavy walker knights can step over things, but they can't end their movement within 1-inch range of enemy units, and that could mean that there's just not enough room for them to quite clear screening squads. I guess the Chaos Knights could help out with their Knights of Shade stratagem that might help a little bit with that and get them into the right things that they need to. In general, though, I think it's going to be a case of just repeatedly throwing the Lancer towards the biggest and scariest threat that the opponent has each turn, and forcing them to deal with it. I think ideally for the fight phase, you'd usually want to keep a command point safe for the reroll charge rolls, and if an Imperial player you think it's going to be some chance of getting charged and killed by the enemy army, then 1 CP to fight in death looks useful to have around as well. And I'd probably look out for opportunities to multi-charge 2 enemy units and try and have 2 things destroyed at once, or potentially even charge down something and then consolidate into something else, so at least you give the opponent the choice of whether or not they want to fall back with 1 unit and make it kind of useless, or stay in combat and get hit by that shock lance. Basically anything with a big multi-wound profile seems absolutely amazing to hit, whether it's super elite infantry or big monsters and vehicles. I think it is going to be a bit wasted fighting hordes if the opponent can screen with those. So overall, for whether it's good or not, I feel like it's certainly strong in that it kills most things that it contacts in combat. The 4+ invul save and the 25 wounds makes it one of the toughest big knights, though it definitely has the downside of being an almost entirely dedicated combat knight. If it gets screened at by junk units, then it's going to have a bad time, and you might have a lot of points of your army kind of useless for a bit, or just if the opponent's got loads of multiple small units that they don't really care about any one of too much. Again, that could be bad news for its damage going across meaningfully. I think there is still a good chance that you might lose it fairly early on as well, even with the invulnerable save. Once it hits the enemy front lines, it's probably going to be right at the front of the army, and then taking massive damage in return. Hopefully it should still draw a whole bunch of damage away from the other knights though, just as a big scary knight that they can't really afford to ignore with its massive threat. For competitors within the indexes, really every big knight is going to be a competitor to this. You can only take so many, so you have to take the most efficient, whether they're ranged or melee. I guess realistically, if you want a dedicated close combat knight, it's probably going to be the Gallant or the Rampager that have got similar sort of stat lines. Maybe Canis Rex as well for the Imperial Knights, having big melee damage of his own. For the Gallant and Rampager, they sort of feel like a Lancer on the cheap mode, kind of similar sort of melee threat, have a few advantages of their own with their own abilities, and maybe a carapace mounted weapon for the Imperial Knights, but they don't get the invulnerable save, which is kind of a big deal, particularly for a more combat-centered knight. Having a look at a few Imperial and Chaos Knight lists, it does seem that at least a few people are playing these competitively already, even before the plastic kit comes out. I noticed that there was an Imperial Knight tournament winning list that included not 1 but 2 Lancers as well, run by Ben Neal, who used it to take down the Denver Flight Club GT, and he appears to have 2 in the list, unupgraded with any enhancements. Kind of a fun Imperial Knight list, I think. It had 2 Lancers, 1 Crusader, 3 Armiger Warglaves, and a Calidus Assassin. You definitely could be threatening first turn charges with that, as it actually looks like one of the lists where you could genuinely consider going for the Questoris Oath for +1 move, shoot and charge. The damage output that you lose might be at least kind of minimal, and with average 27-inch charges first turn from the Lancers, that is kind of terrifying to get them right into the enemy combat zone immediately. Overall, I feel like Games Workshop have done quite well with the Lancers rules though. I'd rate it as pretty good overall. Maybe not auto-include good for the Imperial or Chaos Knights given the points increases, but definitely solidly playable and really quite interesting for a dedicated combat knight. The free tank shock and the invulnerable save are both massive advantages, as is the fast movement. Overall, a good place for them to be in perhaps, maybe not absolutely at the top of the pile and likely to get nerfed too much, but interesting rules that do feel genuinely quite different to a few of the other bigger knights, I think. In any case, let me know your thoughts on the Knight Lancer down in the comments below. Would you be tempted to pick one of these up? And if you have been using them so far for Imperium or Chaos, please let me know how they've been faring in game. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. And if you were looking to pick one of these up, I will leave those links to the discounted Gap Games in Australia and Element Games in the UK, both down in the video description. Otherwise, if you've been enjoying the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description below if you'd like to help support and keep these reviews coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.